Dear friends, as part of your course Sociological Theory and Indian Social Reality, we are going to talk on the subject of power and inequality. Power and inequality is something which we find in all societies. This is also something which has been there for a very, very long time, almost since the beginning of human society. Ever since human beings have begun to live together as social groups, there has been some kind of power structure that emerges in the society, and there have also been some kind of inequalities. The form of inequalities have been changing, but inequalities have existed and they continue to exist in almost all the societies that we know of. And one of the scholars who has been working on the subject of power and social inequality in India has been Professor Andre Bete. He started his career in a sense with a study of a village in Tamil Nadu, where he looked at changing patterns of social inequality in rural India and tried to understand the processes of caste, class and power. And I am very happy to introduce you today to Professor Andre Bete, who is with us in the studio, and we are going to discuss the subject of power and inequality. Professor Bete, if I could start with the general kind of understanding that people in India have today, and that is that Indian society and also perhaps rest of the world has been undergoing some kind of a radical change, and this change is reflected in technology, in social relations, in social institutions and in power structure. How do you react to this kind of popular opinion?
I think that there is no doubt that changes are taking place, and perhaps the pace of change is somewhat faster now than in the past. But I think we mustn't forget that societies are everywhere in a state of change. The fact of change is not new. Our society, for instance, changed a very great deal throughout the 19th century, Indian society. Then independence came in 1947. Since then, there have been many changes, and while we should take note of the changes that are taking place, we should not exaggerate the uniqueness of the time in which we live. We tend to exaggerate the uniqueness of the society in which we live, thinking that our society is unique and cannot be compared with any other society. We also tend to exaggerate the uniqueness of the time in which we live. We must not do that. We must take account of the fact that changes are perhaps more extensive, more rapid today than in the recent past or in the distant past, but change is a feature of all human societies.
Most of the theoretical categories and concepts with which sociologists work in India, or the kind of concepts and theories that we teach in the classroom, were developed in the Western Europe and at a time which in a sense is very far removed from our reality today, in context of industrial revolution, urbanization, democratization that happened in the West European societies in the 19th century. People like Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim were responding to those changes, and they developed their theories to study society, to understand patterns of social inequality and power relations. Do you think those categories are in a sense relevant to understand the dynamics of Indian society today and the kind of processes that India is experiencing, process of change?
Well, some of those categories are relevant and others have ceased to be relevant. And I think that we mustn't forget that while societies keep changing, the sociological studies of society also advance. We mustn't think that Western sociologists are stuck with what Max Weber or Emil Durkheim wrote 100 years ago. So we keep abreast of changes in society and corresponding changes in our approach, in our method, in our concepts. Now, it is true that the lead in developing the sociological approach, the sociological methods and sociological concepts and categories, the lead was taken by Western scholars. Now, what should we do with the concepts and categories that they have developed? Should we put them aside altogether and decide to reinvent these concepts and categories for our own use. This would be, in my view, like trying to reinvent the bicycle or to reinvent the wheel. When we find that those concepts and categories are not very well adapted to our conditions, we should try to change them. But this is what is happening everywhere. It is not as if sociologists in America or in Britain or in France remain stuck with the categories which were developed 100 years ago. I am not too keen to develop concepts and categories that will apply only to our society. I think there is a general pool of sociological ideas, theories, methods, concepts, and we should not turn our back on that, but we should not use those concepts and categories blindly. We should examine for ourselves how those concepts and categories apply in our condition here and now today. And if they don't, then we should adapt them to our conditions. We may even try to devise new concepts and new categories to meet the requirements of the changing times in which we live. But we mustn't forget that everybody throughout the world is living in changing times and conditions. So we should be mindful of the distinctive features of our conditions, of our society, but we should not try to discard whatever has been done before or whatever has been done in another society, in another place and at another time. I always keep on repeating the same thing, that our society is distinctive, but it is not unique. Many of the concepts and categories that were devised 100 years or 150 years ago, it is true that they were devised in Western societies, but take power, for instance, or take social mobility, for instance. Now, we have to adapt those concepts to our times, but they're still very relevant to our times. There are basic general concepts like the distinction between power and status, like the concept of social stratification, like, for instance, social mobility. These apply everywhere, but they have to be adapted for a better understanding of the specific conditions under which we want to apply them. I don't think they apply in the same way in France that they do in India, but they don't apply in the same way in India that they might do in Indonesia. Even within India, we mustn't forget that we are a very large country. We have an agrarian system, we have an industrial system, we have tribal communities, we have metropolitan communities. So we should devise new concepts and new categories, but we should not turn our back on what has been devised simply because it was devised in another country or at another time. We should not adopt them blindly, but we should try to adapt them, and again I repeat, we should not try to reinvent the wheel.
I would like to raise questions about the specific processes of change and Indian social formation, but before that I would like to kind of have your reaction to this notion of classics or canons. In sociology, do you think that there is still significance of reading people like Karl Marx, Max Weber or Emile Durkheim as founders of the discipline?
Yes, I think, personally speaking, I think they are important, although there can be two different views on this, and we must understand what these views are. I have a friend who is an economist, who is a very distinguished mathematical economist. He is professor of economics in Cambridge University. He's an Indian, but he would tell me from time to time that he does not read Marx, and ask me, should I read Marx? Why should I read Marx? Because a great deal of what Marx says is false, so I shouldn't waste my time reading it. And much of what he says is true, but what he says is true has already been incorporated into the textbooks, so I should read the textbooks and find out. Now, I think that this is a perfectly valid argument for a physicist. I don't think many physicists read the Principia of Newton in the original Latin. They don't need to read it. But I think that it is a little different in the human sciences. Therefore, my view is that we should, I at least, find many useful insights in the writings of Marx, of Weber, of Durkheim, and of persons who came after them, and of persons like Merton, like Srinivas, like N.K. Bose, They are all dead now. But I still find many useful insights in their writings, and therefore I go back to their writings over and over again. The thing to guard against is blind imitation of what has been created in the past, and the willingness to adapt, to modify, to change, and to relate them to the conditions which we are examining.
Karl Marx was somebody who started, in a sense, his theory of society with the concept of class, and subjects like inequality and power were also explained through the conceptual category of class by Marx. And later on, Max Weber, in a sense, accepted Marx, but also said that status and power should also be seen as being, in a sense, independent of class, or as different kind of ideal typical structures. And you in your work have also kind of tried to combine Marx and Weber. If one was to look at the structures of authority and power in Indian society today, one would perhaps also want to add things like gender or ethnic differences as dimensions of power. Marx said that, Max Weber said that status and class are, in a sense, different dimensions of power. Can you just elaborate the point that you have also been arguing? What is the difference between Marx and Weber's notion of relationship between power and other dimensions of inequality?
I think that on the whole, first of all, let me say that these were both great intellectuals. Both Marx and Weber were great intellectuals. Weber had this advantage over Marx, that he was born after Marx. He had absorbed what Marx had written and taken out of it what he considered to be really relevant, and set aside what he considered to be inapplicable. This is an advantage which new generations always have over preceding generations, that they can build on the shoulders of their predecessors. But in addition to that, I think there were certain differences in their approach to the study of society. Marx's approach tended to be somewhat less open than Max Weber's approach. I would say that Max Weber's approach was open and pluralistic. Max Weber always kept his eyes and ears open to alternative possibilities. Certainly Max Weber believed that class was extremely important, but he did not believe that that was the only aspect of inequality in a society. Marx had discovered the great importance of the concept of class, and someone who makes such a tremendous discovery tends to become a little possessive about what he has discovered, tends to harp on that discovery over and over again. I don't find fault with Marx for having done that, but there is a kind of overemphasis on one aspect of inequality, indeed of one aspect of society, so that today many people describe the Marxist approach to society as the class approach to society. I think Weber's argument would be that yes, class is very important, and one mustn't ignore the importance that Weber gave in his own writings to class and to economic inequalities and to the distribution of material resources and the inequalities in that distribution. But Weber also drew attention to the independent importance of power. And again, I must say that it's not simply that the ideas have changed. Conditions in society have also changed. Marx did not live in the 20th century. We have just moved out of the 20th century. Lots of things happened in the 20th century which were not known to Marx or even to Weber. We have the experience of what happened in the Soviet Union, and we know therefore that it's not simply ownership of land or ownership of capital that determines the structure of inequality. Significant position in the apparatus of power, whether in the apparatus of government or in the apparatus of the party, can also be a very important independent source of inequality. So Weber had the advantage over Marx. He came later. He was able to benefit from the insights of Marx, and he was able to move further forward. And those who have come after Weber, they may not be as great intellectually as Weber, but they have the benefit of learning from the insights provided by Weber and moving further forward. So this is the way in which an intellectual discipline progresses or ought to progress. This is my view of it.
Continuing with Weber and Marx and coming to the Indian society, Marx himself, when he was in a sense confronted with the realities of India, he in a sense felt like his framework of class and mode of production did not work so neatly and clearly in the Indian case, and he wrote about it. But Max Weber, I think, again had a kind of easier way of dealing with India, because his concept of status group kind of fitted more closely with the reality of caste society. Could you please elaborate on that? What is his notion of status group and how he kind of connects status group with caste?
I think that I would like to repeat that both Marx and Max Weber were intellectual giants. We must not forget that. But Marx did not know very much about India. He did not have any direct experience of India. He had never come to India. He did not know any of the Indian languages. This is also true of Max Weber. Max Weber read very extensively about India, and Max Weber was able to read things that Marx was not able to read, because those things were not available in Marx's time. So Max Weber was much better equipped to understand Indian society by reading the writings of people of various kinds who had already started examining the structure of caste, the structure of agrarian relations in India. But even so, Max Weber did not know any Indian language, and Max Weber had never come to India. So if we move to a later scholar, Louis Dumont, for instance, I don't think that Louis Dumont was as great as either Marx or Max Weber, but he had this advantage. He came to India, he learned Sanskrit, he learned Tamil, he lived in India, and he, of course, had read the writings of Weber and Marx. So he had this advantage, and even Dumont, as I have pointed out, I don't claim to have Dumont's intellectual eminence or his intellectual caliber, but nevertheless I have come after Dumont, and I live in India. I have benefited enormously by reading the writings of Louis Dumont, but I think that there are many inadequacies in those writings, and I have pointed to those as I hope my own students who come after me will also point to the inadequacies in my writing, but I also hope that they will benefit a little bit from what I have written, and then move forward and point to the inadequacies in those writings. That is how knowledge develops, when people take what is best in what is already available and then try to move forward, to add to it. Knowledge is a cumulative thing. It develops over time, and we must therefore always have an open mind.
In order to study caste, you had used Weberian idea of status groups in your early work. How do you think that is still relevant? Can one look at caste as status group today also, like Weber did?
Yes, but I think that castes have undergone great changes, and our understanding of caste has also changed. You see, in the study of society, two things are changing simultaneously. The reality itself is changing, and our understanding of that reality, our conceptual apparatus, is also changing, and it's very difficult for the one to keep pace with the other. I think that what has happened with the caste system is that the ritual aspects of caste, the religious aspects of caste, which were stressed excessively by both Weber and Dumont, are today less important than the political aspects of caste. If one were writing about caste, let us say, at the beginning of the 20th century, one would naturally emphasize the ritual aspects of caste, the preoccupation with the rules of purity and pollution, the maintenance of distance between members of different communities. But if one is writing about caste today, one would perhaps put greater stress on the uses to which caste is put in the electoral process, in the mobilization of political support. And therefore, the idea of caste as a status group, though useful, it is no longer as useful as it had appeared to be to Max Weber.
People say that, I mean, in 1970s and 80s, scholars used to talk about caste as class, or caste would eventually become or transform itself into class. That obviously is not happening. But what is caste then? How do we approach caste today?
I think it's a serious mistake to think that caste will become class. I think it's a very caste and class are two different kinds of animals. Both of them are extremely important. And if you expect that caste will disappear and will be replaced by class, I think this is a serious mistake. Caste and class will coexist. As caste, or rather as ethnicity and class coexist. In American society, they don't have a caste system, but they have a system of ethnic groups. And ethnic groups are stratified, are ranked, but they are not the same thing as class. I think the basic difference between class and caste is that class is defined essentially in terms of the economic attributes of individuals and households, so that an individual can move from one class to another. This is a very frequent occurrence, whereas castes are identified in terms of the attributes of whole collectivities. You cannot move out of a caste, but you can only make caste less relevant in your own life. But you can't change your caste.
So castes are becoming more like communities in a sense. But yes, the class is also not something which is insignificant in India, and you would completely agree with that. Do you think the significance of class or inequalities based on economic ownership of means of production has increased in India today, significance of caste?
Caste or class?
Oh, sorry, significance of class.
Well, I won't say that it has increased, but it's still very important. And our sociologists at one time were turning all their attention on class, and now they have begun to turn all their attention on caste with the lame excuse that caste is a form of class. Caste is not a form of class. And I think that the study of class deserves greater attention, more serious attention from Indian sociologists than it has received in the last 10 or 20 years. It is very important.
People are talking about revival of Karl Marx, particularly in context of the economic crisis and the fact that, with globalization, the classical kind of capitalism is coming back. Do you think that there is a possibility of class conflict emerging in India?
I'm not a revivalist. I don't want to revive Karl Marx. No, I think that we have to. Marx was great. I think, as you rightly pointed out, that it all began with Marx. The study of class began with Marx. But I think that we have to move beyond Marx's conception of class. We have to move beyond the idea that class conflict provides the essential engine for social change. I don't think that that idea of class is going to carry us very far. But I think class remains very important. I think what has happened is that we have come to realize that to try to define class only in terms of property, only in terms of the ownership or non-ownership of the means of production, does not carry us very far. It was a good starting point. We have to take into account also occupation, education, income, and the division of households in terms of the distribution of income, occupation, education. These are very, very important things. But these carry us to a conception of class which is somewhat different from Marx's conception of class. So class is still very relevant. Marx's insights on class should be our starting point, but they should not be our end point.
How would you then finally look at power today? What are the sources of power in Indian society today?
There are many sources of power in Indian society today, as there are in many societies in the world. One is wealth and property. Unequal distribution of material resources is a very important source of power. The other is, of course, the apparatus of political life. That also is a very important source of inequalities in the distribution of power.
Thank you very much, Professor Bete. This has been a great discussion. There are several other questions that one could raise about inequalities and power. For example, over the last 20 years, the concept of gender has become quite significant, and lots of contemporary sociologists are trying to understand gender as a dimension of power. And then one has to also look at how institutionalization of democracy has transformed power relations and what is the significance of it. But some of these would come up in other discussions and lessons that you would have access to. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Professor Bete.
Thank you.